What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets daytime television's most ruthless interrogators? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with the View panel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to have it spiral into one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime TV history. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can turn nuclear when egos collide and political lines are drawn in the sand. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Ford goes toe-to-toe with Joy Behar in a battle that had everyone talking. The tension was palpable from the moment Harrison Ford walked onto the View set. What should have been a friendly chat about his latest film quickly transformed into a verbal battlefield that left viewers stunned and the show's producers scrambling. The legendary actor, known for his no-nonsense attitude both on and off-screen, found himself facing off against a panel that seemed determined to push every button they could find. It all started innocently enough. Ford settled into the guest chair, his trademark smirk barely visible as he exchanged pleasantries with the hosts. Whoopi Goldberg opened with the usual softball questions about his upcoming projects, and for a brief moment, it seemed like this would be just another standard celebrity appearance. But anyone who's followed The View knows that calm waters rarely stay that way for long. So Harrison, we have to talk about your recent comments regarding environmental activism, Joy Behar interjected, cutting through the pleasant chatter like a knife through butter. The shift in energy was immediate and unmistakable. Ford's posture straightened, his jaw tightened slightly, and that famous intensity that made Han Solo and Indiana Jones so compelling suddenly filled the studio. "I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically," Ford replied, his voice measured but carrying an edge that suggested he knew exactly where this was heading. The camera caught the subtle exchange of glances between the panel members, that knowing look that said they'd found their angle for the day. Behar leaned forward, her expression sharpening. "Well, you've been pretty vocal about climate change, calling out politicians and corporations. But some people are saying it's pretty hypocrisy coming from someone who owns multiple planes and flies them regularly. How do you square that circle?" The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras. Ford's famous composure remained intact, but those who knew how to read between the lines could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. This wasn't going to be the typical celebrity deflection followed by nervous laughter and a quick topic change. "I think there's a difference between being conscious of the issues we face as a planet and being perfect in every aspect of your personal life," Ford responded, his tone remaining professional but with an underlying current that suggested he wasn't going to be pushed around. "I've never claimed to be without contradictions, but that doesn't invalidate the science or the urgency of addressing climate change." Sonny Hostin jumped in, seemingly eager to pile on. "But Harrison, don't you think celebrities need to be more careful about their messaging when their lifestyle directly contradicts what they're advocating for? It's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, isn't it?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ford's response came slower this time, more deliberate. "I think what's interesting is how quickly we shift the conversation, from the actual crisis to personal attacks on the messengers. That's exactly the kind of deflection that keeps us from addressing the real issues." Sarah Haynes tried to smooth things over with a diplomatic comment about the complexity of modern life, but Behar wasn't having it. She had the scent of confrontation in her nostrils, and like a predator sensing weakness, she pressed forward with renewed intensity. "Come on, Harrison. You can't seriously expect people to take environmental advice from someone who burns through more jet fuel in a month than most families use in a year. It's not about being perfect, it's about basic credibility." The audience was completely silent now, sensing that something significant was building. Ford's hands, which had been casually resting on his knees, slowly formed fists. Not in an aggressive way, but in the way someone prepares themselves for a fight they didn't want but won't back down from. "You know what I find fascinating," Ford said, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that anyone who's seen his movies knows means business, "is how we've created this culture where you can't advocate for important causes unless you're willing to live like a monk. Meanwhile, the real polluters, the corporations, the governments making policy decisions, they get a free pass because we're too busy attacking the people trying to sound the alarm." Whoopi attempted to jump in with a moderating comment, but Behar was on a roll now, clearly feeling like she had Ford on the defensive. What she didn't seem to realize was that she was poking a bear that had decades of experience handling hostile interrogations from reporters far more skilled than anyone sitting at that table. But that's exactly the point, Harrison. How can you sound the alarm when you're part of the problem? It's like a chain smoker telling people about the dangers of tobacco while lighting up another cigarette. The analogy hung in the air like smoke itself, and Ford's expression shifted from defensive to something approaching contempt. The legendary actor who had faced down space emperors and Nazi archaeologists was about to show the view panel exactly why you don't corner a man who spent a lifetime playing characters who refuse to back down from a fight. I think we need to be very careful about the assumptions we're making here, Ford said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. The pleasant promotional interview was officially dead and buried, and what was rising from its ashes was something far more dangerous and unpredictable than anyone in that studio had bargained for. The shift in Ford's demeanor was unmistakable. Gone was the polite promotional mode that celebrities typically maintained during these appearances. What emerged instead was the raw authenticity that had made him one of Hollywood's most respected figures, and one of its most feared when crossed. Joy Behar, however, seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she had just awakened something she might not be able to control. What assumptions? Behar shot back, her voice rising with the kind of theatrical indignation that had become her trademark. These aren't assumptions, Harrison. These are facts. You fly private jets, you own multiple aircraft, and yet you lecture the rest of us about carbon footprints. That's not an assumption. That's hypocrisy. The word hypocrisy hit the studio like a thunderclap. Ford's eyes narrowed to slits, and for a moment, the silence was so complete you could hear the camera operators breathing. This was no longer a discussion about environmental policy. This had become personal, and everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Hypocrisy, Ford repeated slowly, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. That's interesting coming from someone who works for a network that preaches about environmental responsibility while pumping out hours of content that encourages mass consumption and celebrity worship. The counterattack was swift and surgical, delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent decades in an industry where verbal sparring was an art form. Behar's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Ford pressed his advantage. You want to talk about carbon footprints? Let's talk about the carbon footprint of this show. Let's talk about the resources consumed to bring 5 people together every day to argue about topics they clearly haven't researched beyond reading headlines. Let's talk about the carbon footprint of the network executives who fly around the world making deals while their hosts attack private citizens for doing the same thing. Whoopi Goldberg tried desperately to regain control of the interview. Now hold on, everyone. Let's take a step back here and, no, Ford interrupted, his voice cutting through her attempted mediation like a blade. I think it's time we had an honest conversation instead of this performative nonsense. You brought me here under the pretense of discussing my work, and instead you've chosen to launch a coordinated attack based on talking points that sound like they came straight from a fossil fuel industry playbook. The accusation hung in the air like a live grenade. Behar's eyes flashed with fury, and she leaned forward aggressively, abandoning any pretense of professional composure. Are you seriously suggesting that we're somehow in the pocket of oil companies because we called out your obvious contradictions? That's rich, Harrison. That's really rich. What I'm suggesting, Ford replied, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet register again, is that you've chosen to make this interview about everything except the actual environmental crisis we're facing. Instead of discussing solutions, instead of talking about the science, instead of having a meaningful conversation about the future of our planet, you've decided to make it about me personally. And I have to wonder why that is. Sarah Haynes attempted to jump in with a question about Ford's latest film, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters, but it was too late. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was backing down. Because actions matter more than words. Harrison, Sunny Hostin interjected, her voice carrying the prosecutorial tone she'd honed during her legal career. And your actions don't match your rhetoric. It's that simple. Ford turned his full attention to Hostin, and the intensity of his gaze was enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her seat. My actions? Let me tell you something about my actions. I've donated millions of dollars to conservation efforts. I've used my platform to raise awareness about climate change for decades. I've supported legislation, funded research, and worked with scientists around the world to address these issues. But none of that matters to you because I own an airplane. It's not just that you own an airplane. Behar jumped back in, clearly, not willing to let Hostin take over her confrontation. It's that you use it constantly while telling everyone else to reduce their carbon footprint. You can't have it both ways. The studio audience was completely transfixed now. This wasn't the usual daytime television drama where disagreements were manufactured for entertainment value. This was real, raw conflict between people who clearly despised each other's positions, and everyone could feel the electricity in the air. Ford stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and commanding. The simple action sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing that something significant was about to happen. You know what the real problem is here? Ford said, his voice now carrying the full authority of someone who'd commanded respect in Hollywood for over 4 decades. The real problem is that you've confused being loud with being right. You've confused attack journalism with actual journalism. And you've confused having a platform with having wisdom. Behar was on her feet now too, matching Ford's intensity with aggressive body language of her own. Don't you dare lecture us about journalism, Harrison. We ask the tough questions that other shows are afraid to ask. We hold people accountable, including celebrities who think they can say whatever they want without being challenged. Accountable? Ford's laugh was harsh and humorless. Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a coordinated character assassination designed to generate headlines and social media buzz. There's nothing accountable about ambushing a guest with personal attacks while ignoring the substance of the issues they're trying to address. The temperature in the room had reached a boiling point. Whoopi made another desperate attempt to restore order, but her voice was drowned out by the crackling tension between Ford and Behar, who now stood facing each other like gunslingers in the middle of a dusty street. If you don't like the questions, maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on the show, Behar snarled, her composure completely shattered now. Nobody forced you to be here. Ford's response came with the kind of cold fury that made his movie villains so memorable. You're absolutely right about that. And that's a mistake I won't be making again. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for the interview. What had started as a promotional appearance had devolved into something far more serious. A battle for respect, dignity, and the right to advocate for causes without being subjected to character assassination. The studio felt like a powder keg that had just been lit, and everyone knew the explosion was coming. Behar, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far, but unable to back down now, doubled down with the kind of reckless abandon that had made her both famous and infamous. Good. Maybe next time you'll think twice before coming on television to preach about issues you clearly don't understand the complexities of. That was the moment everything changed. Ford's expression shifted from anger to something far more dangerous. Contempt mixed with a cold calculation that suggested he was done playing defense. The legendary actor who had spent decades perfecting his craft was about to deliver a performance that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Complexities? Ford's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than all of Behar's shouting combined. You want to talk about complexities? Let me tell you about complexity, Joy. Complexity is trying to use your platform to raise awareness about the greatest threat facing our planet while knowing that every word you say will be twisted, every action you take will be scrutinized, and every effort you make will be dismissed by people who mistake cynicism for wisdom. The studio was dead silent now. Even the crew members had stopped moving, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford began to pace, his movement predatory and deliberate, like a lawyer delivering a closing argument that would determine the fate of civilization itself. Complexity is understanding that perfect is the enemy of good, that waiting for messengers who meet your arbitrary standards of purity means waiting forever while the planet burns. Complexity is knowing that the same people who attack advocates for their perceived hypocrisy are the same people who will attack them for being out of touch if they don't have the resources to travel and see the problems firsthand. Sonny Hostin tried to interrupt, But Ford's raised hand silenced her with an authority that brooked no argument. He was in full command now, and everyone in that room knew it. But here's what's not complex, Joy. What's not complex is the science that shows our planet is in crisis. What's not complex is the data that proves human activity is driving climate change. What's not complex is the fact that we need every voice, every platform, and every person willing to speak up, regardless of whether they meet your personal standards of environmental sainthood. Behar's face was red with fury and embarrassment. She could feel control of the situation slipping away from her completely, and in a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, she made the mistake that would seal her fate. Don't lecture me about science, Harrison. I've been covering these issues longer than you've been flying around in your private jets playing environmental activist. The insult landed like a physical blow, and Ford's response was swift and devastating. Covering these issues? Is that what you call it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been covering these issues the same way a tabloid covers celebrity scandals, with sensationalism, personal attacks, and a complete disregard for the actual facts. Whoopi Goldberg made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the interview. Okay, everyone, let's take a breath here. We're all on the same side when it comes to protecting the environment, right? But Ford wasn't finished. The dam had burst, and years of frustration with gotcha journalism and bad faith interrogations came pouring out in a torrent of controlled fury. Are we on the same side, Whoopi? Because it seems to me that one side is trying to address the greatest crisis of our time, while the other side is more interested in scoring cheap points and generating viral moments. One side is focusing on solutions, while the other side is focused on tearing down anyone who dares to speak up. Behar couldn't contain herself any longer. You're unbelievable. You come on our show, you get called out for your hypocrisy, and instead of owning up to it, you attack us? That's rich coming from someone who made a career playing make-believe heroes. The personal attack on his career was the final straw. Ford stopped pacing and turned to face Behar directly, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made his most intimidating movie moments look tame by comparison. Make-believe heroes? Ford's voice was dangerously quiet now. You're right about one thing, Joy. I have spent my career playing heroes. But the difference between me and you is that I know the difference between playing a role and being a person. I don't confuse having a television show with having moral authority. I don't mistake being given a microphone with being given wisdom. And I certainly don't confuse attacking people with accomplishing anything meaningful. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Ford began moving toward the edge of the set, his body language making it clear that this interview was over, whether the hosts liked it or not. You know what the real tragedy is here? Ford continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. The real tragedy is that we could have had a conversation that mattered. We could have talked about solutions, about hope, about the incredible innovations that are giving us a chance to address climate change. Instead, you chose to make it about personalities and gotcha moments. You chose to make it about everything except the thing that actually matters. Behar made one last, desperate attempt to maintain control. You can't just walk away from legitimate questions, Harrison. You can't just storm off when you don't like being held accountable. Ford paused at the edge of the set and turned back to face the panel one final time. What he said next would be replayed on social media for weeks, analyzed by media critics, and remembered as one of the most devastating takedowns in television history. Legitimate questions? Joy, there wasn't a single legitimate question in this entire ambush. You didn't ask about the science. You didn't ask about solutions. You didn't ask about the work being done by countless dedicated people around the world. You asked about my personal life so you could score cheap points and feel superior. That's not journalism. That's tabloid gossip dressed up as moral authority. He began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. And you're right about one thing. I am walking away. I'm walking away from this mockery of journalism, from this theater of the absurd, and from the kind of toxic discourse that makes it impossible to have meaningful conversations about the issues that matter most. The microphone hit the floor, with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent studio. Ford straightened his jacket and looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience that had watched this confrontation unfold. To everyone watching at home, I want you to know that there are people working every day to address climate change, to find solutions, to make our world better for future generations. Don't let shows like this convince you that cynicism and attack journalism are the same thing as holding people accountable. The planet needs all of us working together, not tearing each other down for the entertainment of others. With that, Harrison Ford turned and walked off the View set with the same confident stride that had carried him through decades of memorable movie exits. The panel sat in stunned silence, clearly unsure how to respond to what had just happened. Behar looked like she'd been hit by a truck, while the other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing the aftermath of what would go down as one of the most explosive celebrity interviews in daytime television history. When the show finally cut to commercial, the damage was done. Ford had delivered a masterclass in how to stand up to bullying disguised as journalism, and the internet was already exploding with reactions. The interview was over, but the conversation Ford had started would continue long after the studio lights dimmed. He had walked into that studio as a celebrity promoting a movie and walked out as something else entirely, a person who had refused to be diminished by the very system that had tried to tear him down. And in doing so, he had shown everyone watching that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's game.